You are nothing but a weakling, Elisa. An Omega. David's voice echoed across the moonlit plaza, cold and absolute, piercing the sudden silence of the Crescent Moon Pack. He stood tall, the newly crowned Alpha King, his eyes devoid of the warmth she'd known all her life. I, David, reject you as my mate. The words shattered her world, turning years of quiet devotion into public humiliation. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Elisa stood frozen, tears blurring the silver light, her heart tearing at the seams. But before she could speak, before she could even breathe, a deep, resonant voice cut through the heavy air, vibrating with ancient power. If the Crescent King discards his treasure so carelessly, the voice boomed, then the blood moon claims her. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and impending snow. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. David's coronation as Alpha King of the Crescent Moon Pack was the culmination of everything he had worked for. For Elisa, it was supposed to be the beginning of their life together. They had grown up side by side, their bond and unspoken truth recognized by everyone, even if never officially declared. She had spent hours preparing, her simple white gown a stark contrast to the opulent furs worn by the higher-ranking pack members. She was an Omega, yes, but she was his Omega. Or so she had believed. The plaza was a sea of shifting bodies and murmured excitement. Torches cast flickering shadows across the ancient stone walls of the pack house. Elisa stood near the front, her hands clasped tightly together, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. When David stepped onto the dais, the roar of the crowd was deafening. He looked every bit a king, strong, imposing, his jaw set in a hard line. He raised a hand, and silence fell instantly. He didn't look at her initially. He spoke of duty, of strength, of the future of the pack. His words were sharp, clinical. Then his gaze swept over the crowd, finally landing on her. There was no recognition in his eyes, only a chilling emptiness. The strength of a pack lies in its leaders, David announced, his voice carrying easily over the hushed assembly. An alpha requires a Luna who can stand beside him, not cower behind him. Elisa felt a cold dread pool in her stomach. The words felt pointed, cruel. Therefore, David continued, the silence now thick and suffocating, I cannot in good conscience accept the bond the moon goddess has presented. He pointed a finger directly at her. The gesture felt like a physical blow. You are nothing but a weakling, Elisa. An Omega. I, David, reject you as my mate. The world tilted. The collective gasp of the pack seemed distant, muted by the roaring in her ears. He had rejected her. Publicly, brutally. The pain was immediate and visceral, a searing agony that tore through her chest, severing a connection that had existed before she was even aware of it. She stumbled back a step, the white gown suddenly feeling like a shroud. Whispers erupted around her, sharp and stinging like a swarm of angry bees. She saw pity in some eyes, malicious glee in others. She was the discarded mate, the Omega deemed unworthy. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, to demand an explanation. But her throat was tight, choked with unshed tears and a profound sense of betrayal. David stood impassive, observing the fallout of his words with cold detachment. He had made his choice. Power over love. Strength over loyalty. Elisa felt her knees weaken. The rejection was not just emotional. It was physical. A tearing away of a vital part of her soul. She closed her eyes, preparing for the inevitable collapse. The final humiliation of falling apart before the pack that had just witnessed her discarding. Then, the air shifted. The scent of pine and snow was suddenly overpowered by something darker, heavier. ozone and smoke, blood and old magic. A figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the plaza, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that commanded immediate attention. He was taller than David, broader, his presence dominating the space without a single word. He wore dark leathers, unadorned and practical, yet he looked more royal than anyone present. The murmurs died instantly, replaced by a tense, frightened silence. Even David stepped back slightly, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of his ceremonial blade. If the Crescent King discards his treasure so carelessly, the deep, resonant voice boomed, sending shivers down Elisa's spine. Then the blood moon claims her. The stranger stepped into the torchlight, revealing striking features hardened by war, and a pair of eyes that burned with intense, unyielding amber. It was Kyle, the Alpha King of the Blood Moon Pack, a rival faction known for their ruthlessness and unmatched strength. They hadn't crossed Crescent Moon territory in decades. He didn't look at David. His burning gaze was fixed entirely on Elisa. He walked toward her, the crowd parting before him like water. He stopped a mere arm's length away, towering over her. The scent of ozone and smoke was intoxicating, grounding her in the sudden chaos. "Are you injured?" Kyle asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. Meant only for her ears despite the absolute silence of the plaza. Elisa, still reeling from the rejection, could only shake her head mutely. Kyle turned his attention to David, the gentleness vanishing, replaced by a cold fury that seemed to lower the temperature in the square. A king who cannot recognize value is no king at all. You have severed your bond. By the ancient laws, she is free. David bristled, his pride wounded. She is an omega of my pack. You have no jurisdiction here, Kyle. I have the jurisdiction of power. Kyle stated simply, the threat implicit and terrifying. And I claim the right of the unbonded. He turned back to Elisa, extending a hand scarred by battle but steady as stone. Come with me, Elisa. Let me show you what a true king values. The silence in the plaza was absolute, a fragile tension waiting to snap. Every eye was locked on the confrontation. The newly crowned, arrogant Crescent King, the formidable Blood Moon interloper, and the fragile Omega caught between them. Elisa stared at the extended hand. It was an offer of salvation, a lifeline thrown into a raging storm. But it was also a leap into the unknown, with a man whose reputation was painted in blood and shadows. She looked at David. His handsome face was twisted in a mixture of outrage and disbelief. He had expected her to crumble, to slink away in shame, perhaps to beg for scraps of his affection. He had not expected this. Elisa, David warned, his voice low and dangerous. Do not be foolish. He is a monster. Kale didn't flinch. He didn't even look at David. He kept his amber eyes fixed on her, waiting patiently, his hand still extended. He was offering a choice, the very thing David had stripped from her. The pain in her chest, the raw agony of the severed bond, flared anew. She remembered the years of quiet service, the stolen moments in the library, the whispered promises that David had just so callously broken. She was nothing to him. A weakling. She looked back at Kyle. The monster. The enemy. Yet, in his eyes, she saw no pity, no disgust. She saw something else. A strange, fierce recognition. Slowly, deliberately, Elisa reached out and placed her small hand in his. The contact was electric. A jolt of energy shot up her arm, not painful but incredibly warm, chasing away the bone-deep chill of David's rejection. Kale's fingers closed gently around hers, a solid, grounding weight. David roared in fury. Guards, seize them! A dozen Crescent Moon warriors stepped forward, drawing weapons, their faces tight with anxiety. They were facing the Blood Moon King. They knew the odds. Kajal didn't draw a weapon. He simply turned, pulling Elisa slightly behind him, shielding her with his massive frame. He unleashed a low, rumbling growl that resonated in the chest of everyone present. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical force, a display of raw, dominant power that brought the advancing guards to a shuddering halt. "Any man who takes another step," Kyle said, his voice quiet but echoing with lethal promise, "dies tonight." The guards hesitated, looking to David for further command, but David seemed momentarily paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of Kyle's aura. "She has made her choice," Kyle announced, his voice carrying over the paralyzed crowd. "She is under the protection of the Blood Moon. Any action against her is an act of war against my entire pack." He turned back to Elisa, his amber eyes softening a fraction. "We leave now." He didn't wait for David's response. He kept a firm but gentle hold on her hand, guiding her through the parted crowd. They walked slowly, deliberately, not running, projecting an image of absolute control. Elisa kept her eyes downcast, the adrenaline beginning to crash, leaving her trembling. She was leaving the only home she had ever known, walking away with the most dangerous man in the territories, leaving behind the man she thought she loved. As they reached the edge of the plaza, entering the tree line where Kale's escort undoubtedly waited, a small, desperate voice broke the silence. "Elisa!" It was Anna, a young beta she had mentored in the kitchens. The girl was crying, her face pale with fear. Elisa paused, looking back over her shoulder. The faces in the crowd were a blur of shock and confusion. Then she met David's eyes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a strange, simmering darkness. He hadn't wanted her, but he couldn't stand that someone else did. "Goodbye, Anna," Elisa called back softly. Kale pulled her gently forward, into the shadows of the forest. Waiting for them were 5 massive wolves, their coats dark as night, their eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. They didn't growl. They simply parted to let their alpha and his new charge through. A sleek, black SUV was parked on a hidden dirt road. Kyle opened the passenger door for her, a gesture of unexpected courtesy. "Get in," he said softly. Elisa hesitated. "Where are we going?" "To the Blood Moon," Kyle replied, his tone serious, "where you will be safe." She climbed in, the leather seat cold against her back. Kyle shut the door and moved to the driver's side. As the engine roared to life, Elisa looked out the window toward the glow of the plaza torches. She had been an outcast, an Omega, a rejected mate. Now, she was something else entirely, the prize of the Blood Moon King. The consequences of this night would shake the foundations of both packs, and she was at the very center of the storm. The interior of the SUV was a cocoon of heated leather and silence, a stark contrast to the freezing, chaotic plaza they had just left behind. Elisa sat rigidly against the passenger door, staring blankly at the blur of ancient pines rushing past the tinted window. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the crowd was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in the center of her chest. It was the phantom pain of a severed bond, an invisible tether that David had brutally cut. Every time she inhaled, her lungs felt lined with shattered glass. Kale drove with silent precision. His large hands gripped the steering wheel easily, his posture relaxed but alert. He did not press her for conversation. For the first 20 miles, the only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional sharp crack of tires rolling over fallen branches. The silence wasn't oppressive. Rather, it felt like a deliberate shield he had constructed to give her space to breathe. A sudden, sharp spasm clamped down on Elisa's heart. She gasped, doubling over slightly as her hands flew to her chest. The pain of the rejection was setting in fully, a biological shock to her system. Omegas were inherently fragile when it came to pack bonds. Being cast out by an alpha, especially one she had loved since childhood, was physically devastating. Cale's head snapped toward her. He smoothly guided the heavy vehicle to the shoulder of the dirt road, shifting it into park. He unbuckled his seatbelt and reached into the back seat, retrieving a heavy, dark woolen blanket. "Breathe," Kyle instructed, his deep voice maintaining a calm, even cadence. He draped the heavy wool over her trembling shoulders. "Short, shallow breaths only feed the panic. Inhale through your nose. Match my rhythm." He didn't touch her directly, respecting the invisible boundary between them. But he leaned close enough that his scent, wood smoke, rain on hot stones, and raw power, enveloped her. It was an overwhelmingly dominant scent. Yet, strangely, it didn't command her to submit. It simply anchored her. Elisa squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the tears that threatened to spill, and forced her lungs to expand in time with a deep, steady rise and fall of Kyle's chest. "The severing is worst in the first hour," Kyle said softly, his amber eyes watching her face with analytical intensity. "He tore away a foundation you relied on. But foundations can be rebuilt, Elisa. Stronger than before." She opened her eyes, looking at him properly for the first time since they left. His face was a landscape of hard angles and old scars, a map of battles fought and won. There was a dangerous edge to him, a lethality that was impossible to ignore. Yet, the way he looked at her held no pity. "Why did you do it?" Her voice was a hoarse whisper, raw and broken. "Why take an Omega from a rival pack? You just started a war." Cale's jaw tightened, a fleeting shadow crossing his expression. David started a war the moment he insulted the ancient laws on his coronation night. A king who abuses his power to humiliate the vulnerable is a threat to the stability of all territories. "As for why I took you," he paused, his gaze dropping to where her hands clutched the blanket. "Perhaps I saw something he was too blind to see." Before she could dissect his cryptic answer, Kyle shifted the car back into drive, merging seamlessly back onto the dark road. An hour later, the dense forest began to thin, giving way to a sprawling, heavily fortified compound. Elisa's eyes widened. She had expected a grim fortress, a reflection of the Blood Moon's ruthless reputation. Instead, the estate was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Vast structures of dark steel and expansive glass blended seamlessly into the side of a massive, rocky cliff. Subtle, low-level lighting illuminated manicured pathways and sleek security checkpoints. As they approached the main gate, heavily armed guards stepped forward. Recognizing Cale's vehicle, they immediately lowered their weapons, standing at rigid attention. There was no fear in their posture, only deep, unwavering respect. Kyle bypassed the main entrance, driving around to a secluded underground garage. When the engine cut off, the quiet returned. He stepped out and walked around to open her door. "Welcome to the Blood Moon," Kyle said, extending his hand once more. Elisa hesitated, the weight of her reality pressing down on her. She was in enemy territory. Yet, as she looked at Kyle's scarred, steady hand, she realized the only true enemy she had faced tonight was the man she had left behind. Gathering her courage, she slipped her hand into his, stepping out of the vehicle and into a life she could never have imagined. Back at the Crescent Moon Plaza, the celebratory atmosphere had disintegrated into chaotic murmurs and nervous pacing. The torches, once symbols of a bright new era, now cast long, menacing shadows across the ancient stones. The crowd had thinned considerably, most pack members retreating to their homes in hushed, frightened clusters. They had gathered to witness the dawn of a powerful king. Instead, they had witnessed a profound humiliation and the terrifying arrival of a legendary rival. David stood alone on the raised stone dais. The elaborate fur cloak draped over his shoulders felt suddenly heavy, stifling him. His hands rested on the carved wooden railing, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. He stared at the dark tree line where Elisa and Kyle had vanished, his chest heaving with a mixture of disbelief and boiling rage. He had calculated every move. Rejecting Elisa publicly was meant to be a display of uncompromising strength. A clear message to the elders that he would not let childish sentimentality dictate the future of the pack. She was weak, soft-spoken, content to blend into the background. She was entirely unsuitable to be a Luna. He had expected her to cry, perhaps to run away in shame, cementing his narrative. He had not expected Kale. "Alpha." A cautious voice broke his dark reverie. David turned slowly, his eyes flashing with suppressed fury. It was Thomas, his newly appointed beta. The older man looked visibly shaken, his usual confident demeanor replaced by deep anxiety. "Report," David snapped, his voice harsher than intended. The perimeter guards confirmed Kyle crossed the border with a small elite escort. They moved like ghosts, Alpha. No alarms were triggered until he stepped into the plaza, Thomas explained, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "The pack is unsettled. The elders are requesting an emergency council. The Blood Moon taking an unbonded from our territory under threat of war. It is an unprecedented breach of treaty." David slammed his fist against the railing, the sound echoing like a gunshot across the empty square. "She is not unbonded. She is a citizen of the Crescent Moon. He stole her." Thomas hesitated, choosing his next words with extreme care. "Respectfully, Alpha, you severed the bond publicly. By the old laws, the moment an Alpha casts out a mate without formal cause or trial, she becomes unbonded, free to be claimed by anyone who offers protection." Kyle exploited a technicality. "A technicality?" David roared, closing the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He grabbed Thomas by the lapels of his jacket. "He humiliated me on my coronation night. He walked into my home, threatened my guards, and took what belonged to me." "She didn't belong to you anymore, David." A sharp, feminine voice echoed from the steps of the dais. David released Thomas, turning to see his mother and the former Luna standing in the shadows. Her face was pale, drawn tight with disappointment. "You played a dangerous game with pride, my son," she said, ascending the steps slowly. "You sought to look strong by crushing something delicate. But true strength recognizes value in all forms. You discarded Elisa without truly looking at her. She is an Omega," David sneered, pacing like a caged animal. "She has no value beyond the kitchens and the nurseries." His mother shook her head, a sad, knowing smile touching her lips. "Is that what you believe? You have spent so much time studying war and politics, you forgot to study your own people. The Moon Goddess does not pair alphas with useless mates. If she was destined for you, there was a reason. A reason Kale clearly recognized the moment he laid eyes on her." The words struck David like a physical blow. He froze, his mind racing. What could Kale possibly want with a simple, quiet girl? The Blood Moon Pack valued strength above all else. They didn't take in charity cases. They took assets. A cold sliver of doubt, sharper than his anger, pierced his ego. Had he missed something? Was there a dormant power, a hidden lineage, a secret locked inside Elisa that he had been too arrogant to see? "Prepare a diplomatic envoy," David ordered Thomas, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "We will send a message to the Blood Moon at first light. We demand the immediate return of our citizen." Thomas swallowed hard. "And if Cale refuses?" David looked back at the dark tree line, the image of Elisa willingly placing her hand in Cale's burning brightly in his mind. The betrayal stung more than the insult to his pride. "If he refuses," David said softly, the words dripping with absolute malice, "then we prepare for war. No one makes a fool of the Crescent King and lives." Sunlight, harsh and brilliantly white, spilled across the charcoal-colored bedding. Elisa woke with a sharp gasp, her hands instinctively clutching the fine linen covering her chest. For a terrifying fraction of a second, her mind projected the familiar, stifling walls of her small quarters in the Crescent Moon pack house. Then, the expansive, minimalist architecture of the room came into sharp focus, and the memories of the previous night crashed over her like a tidal wave of ice water. The rejection, the phantom agony of the severed bond, the terrifying escape. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. The physical toll of an alpha's public rejection was not a myth. It felt as though she had been beaten, her very cells bruised by the violent tearing of the ethereal tether that had tied her to David. Yet, as she drew a breath, she noticed something profoundly strange. The air in her lungs did not catch on the familiar, heavy knot of anxiety she had carried for years. The constant thrumming pressure of trying to be small, of trying to be invisible to avoid David's eventual disdain, was entirely gone. In its place was a vast, echoing emptiness. It was terrifying, but it was also entirely her own. Throwing off the covers, Elisa stepped onto the heated stone floor. The guest suite was a masterclass in modern luxury, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying, breathtaking view of a deep, pine-filled gorge. The Blood Moon territory was wild, untamed, yet perfectly managed by the sheer will of its inhabitants. A soft, polite knock at the heavy oak door startled her. Before she could speak, the door opened a fraction. "Good morning," a calm, melodic voice called out. A woman stepped into the room, carrying a silver tray laden with fresh fruit, warm bread, and steaming coffee. She was tall, her silver hair pulled back into a severe braid. But her amber eyes, the hallmark of the Blood Moon lineage, were remarkably kind. "I am Elara, pack healer and Cale's sister." Elisa instinctively lowered her gaze, stepping back and exposing the vulnerability of her neck. The ingrained, submissive response of a Crescent Moon Omega to a high-ranking pack member. Elara stopped in her tracks. The gentle smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound sorrow. "No," she said softly, her voice firm but lacking any command. She set the tray down on a glass table. "You do not do that here, Elisa. Not with me. Not with anyone." Elisa looked up, confusion warring with the lingering exhaustion in her mind. "But I am an Omega, and an outsider. You are a guest of the Alpha King," Elara corrected gently, walking closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "And in the Blood Moon, your designation does not dictate your dignity. Kyle would burn this compound to the ground before he allowed anyone to force you into submission." The absolute certainty in Elara's voice sent a strange ripple through Elisa's chest. It was a concept so alien she struggled to process it. She moved toward the table, the rich aroma of the coffee finally penetrating her shock. "He is currently in the lower training levels," Elara continued, pouring a cup of the dark liquid. "He requested that you eat, rest, and when you are ready, he wishes to speak with you in his study. He explicitly stated that it is a request, not a summons." Elisa took the warm mug, the heat seeping into her cold fingers. "Why is he doing this, Elara?" David severed the bond. I have no political value. I have no wealth. I am nothing but a liability that has brought an enemy to your doorstep. Alara's gaze sharpened, her eyes assessing Elisa with a piercing, analytical intelligence that mirrored her brother's. You underestimate the blindness of your former alpha, she murmured, turning toward the door. Kyle does not deal in liabilities. He deals in potential. Eat, Elisa. You will need your strength for what comes next. When the door clicked shut, Elisa was left alone with the staggering weight of the healer's words. She ate methodically, the food tasteless ashes in her mouth, her mind spinning with fragmented memories. She thought of the times she had quietly solved logistical crises in the Crescent Pack kitchens, the way she could intuitively sense shifts in the pack's emotional climate long before the elders did. David had always dismissed these instances as Omega sensitivity. Had Kale seen something else entirely? An hour later, bathed and dressed in the simple, high-quality garments she had found in the wardrobe, Elisa navigated the silent, sunlit corridors. The estate was eerily quiet, yet it hummed with an undercurrent of immense, disciplined energy. She found Kale's study at the end of a long, glass-walled hallway. The heavy mahogany doors were ajar. She paused at the threshold. Kyle stood by a massive window, his back to her. He was no longer wearing the dark leathers from the plaza. Instead, he wore tailored slacks and a simple fitted charcoal shirt that did nothing to hide the broad, dangerous lines of his physique. He was looking out over the gorge, utterly still. You move quietly, Kyle said, his deep voice resonating in the quiet room. He did not turn around. A survival mechanism, I imagine. Learned from living in a house that did not want you to take up space. Elisa stepped into the room, her heart beginning to pound a steady rhythm against her ribs. You requested to see me. Kale finally turned. The morning light caught the jagged scar running along his jawline. His amber eyes locked onto hers, holding that same intense, unyielding focus she had seen in the plaza. But today, there was no anger. Only a quiet, terrifying patience. I wanted to ensure you survived the night, he said softly, walking slowly toward a heavy leather chair and gesturing for her to sit opposite him. The severing of a childhood tether is a violent trauma. Many do not possess the mental fortitude to endure it without losing their minds. Elisa remained standing, her hands clutched tightly together. I am standing. I am breathing. You are surviving, Kyle corrected, his gaze never wavering. There is a difference. David conditioned you to survive. He trained you to be small, to be silent, to be exactly what his fragile ego required. He paused, the air between them growing thick with unspoken truths. I did not bring you here to survive, Elisa. I brought you here so you could finally begin to live. The tranquility of the Blood Moon compound was shattered just before noon. Elisa was in the expansive library, her fingers tracing the spines of ancient, leather-bound tomes detailing pack histories she had never been permitted to read, when the distinct, heavy crunch of tires on gravel echoed from the front courtyard. She froze, a familiar, icy dread uncoiling in her stomach. She walked slowly to the towering windows. Below, beyond the heavily reinforced steel gates, 3 sleek, black SUVs bearing the Silver Crescent emblem had come to a halt. Armed Blood Moon sentinels had already surrounded the vehicles, their weapons lowered, but their posture radiating lethal readiness. From the lead vehicle stepped Thomas, the Crescent Moon's beta. He looked impeccably dressed in a dark suit, but from this distance, Elisa could see the rigid tension in his shoulders, the nervous way his eyes darted across the imposing architecture of the cliffside estate. He had brought an envoy, not an army, but the message was clear. David wanted his property back. They moved faster than I anticipated. Cale's voice murmured from the doorway. Elisa spun around. She hadn't heard him enter. He stood in the frame, his expression entirely unreadable. The relaxed aura he had maintained in the study was gone, replaced by the terrifying cold majesty of the Alpha King she had witnessed the night before. "He sent Thomas," Elisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He demands my return. He demands the return of his pride," Cale corrected smoothly, stepping into the room. "You are merely the vessel through which he believes he can reclaim it." He walked toward her, stopping only when he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame. He looked down at her, his amber eyes searching her face. "You do not have to see them," Kyle stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I will handle the beta. I will send them back across the border with a message that will ensure they never cross it again." Elisa looked back out the window. Thomas was arguing with the captain of the guard, his gestures growing frantic. A sickening realization washed over her. If she hid, if she allowed Cale to fight this battle for her while she cowered in a library, she was proving David right. She would be the weak, helpless Omega he had always claimed she was, merely trading one Alpha's shadow for another's protection. "No," Elisa said, the word startling her with its firmness. She looked up, meeting Cale's burning gaze. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she forced her chin up. "If he has a message concerning my life, I want to hear it directly. I will not hide." A slow, barely perceptible shift occurred in Cale's expression. The hard lines around his mouth softened marginally, and something akin to profound respect flickered in the depths of his eyes. "Very well," Kyle agreed softly. "Walk with me." The grand meeting hall of the Blood Moon was a cavernous space of polished dark stone and heavy timber. A massive rectangular table dominated the center, completely devoid of the ostentatious thrones or banners that decorated David's hall. Here, power was implied by the architecture itself, not by gilded decorations. Cale did not take a seat at the head of the table. He stood casually near the center, motioning for Elisa to stand beside him. The physical proximity was a deliberate, undeniable statement of alignment. The heavy double doors swung open, and Thomas was escorted inside by two massive sentinels. The Crescent Beta stopped a few feet from the table, his eyes immediately darting to Elisa. Relief, followed quickly by deep apprehension, washed over his features. "Alpha Cale," Thomas began, his voice surprisingly steady, though his scent reeked of metallic fear. He offered a shallow, formal bow. "I bring greetings from the Crescent King, and a formal diplomatic request regarding the return of a stolen citizen." "You bring the whining of a foolish boy," Cale replied, his voice a low, vibrating purr that resonated off the stone walls. "And a request built on a flawed premise. Nothing was stolen. I claimed and unbonded." Thomas swallowed hard, pulling a rolled parchment from his jacket. "David formally contests the classification of unbonded. The public severing was a moment of high emotion, not a ratified decree. Elisa remains a member of the Crescent Moon, subject to its laws and its king. Alpha David demands her immediate return, or he will view her prolonged detention as an act of war." The word hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. War. The devastation of thousands of lives over a single wounded ego. Elisa felt the blood drain from her face. She was not worth a war. She took a step forward, breaking the protective perimeter of Kyle's presence. "Thomas," she said, her voice surprisingly clear, echoing in the vast space. The Beta looked at her, his expression pleading. "Elisa, please. Come home. The king is willing to give this indiscretion. He is willing to quietly re-establish your position within the pack infrastructure." My position? Elisa repeated, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping her lips. You mean my position in the kitchens? My position as a target for his cruelest jokes? He rejected me before the entire kingdom, Thomas. He called me nothing. He was angry, Elisa. You know the pressure he is under. I know the man he is, she interrupted, the lingering pain of the severed bond morphing into a cold, hardened clarity. He did not sever the bond in a moment of passion. He calculated it. He wanted to break me to show his strength. She glanced at Kyle, finding him watching her with an intense, silent encouragement. She turned back to the envoy. I am not a piece of property to be misplaced and demanded back, Thomas. I have no home in the Crescent Moon. Tell David I heard his rejection perfectly clearly. And tell him... She paused, taking a deep breath. Tell him I accept it. Thomas physically recoiled, the color draining entirely from his face. By verbally accepting the rejection in front of witnesses, she had legally and magically finalized the severing. It was irrevocable. Kale stepped forward, his massive presence instantly overwhelming the room. The casual demeanor evaporated, replaced by the terrifying, predatory aura of a true Alpha King. You have your answer, Beta, Kyle said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, icy register. She is unbonded no longer. She is under the eternal protection of the Blood Moon. Return to your master. Tell him if he wishes to pursue this folly, he knows where to find my borders. But assure him, if a single crescent wolf steps foot on my land, I will not stop until I'm sitting on his throne. The heavy, iron-banded doors of the meeting hall groaned shut behind Thomas, sealing the Crescent Moon envoy out and leaving a profound, vibrating silence in his wake. Elisa remained rooted to the polished stone floor, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow staccatos. The words she had spoken to Thomas, her final, unyielding acceptance of David's rejection, still rang in her own ears. It felt as though she had stepped off a towering cliff in the pitch black, expecting to fall into nothingness, only to find solid, unyielding ground beneath her feet. Kale stood mere inches away, his massive frame radiating a calm, anchoring heat. He did not immediately speak, allowing the sheer magnitude of her action to settle over her. When he finally moved, it was only to turn slightly, his amber eyes catching the muted light filtering through the high, clerestory windows. The predatory, terrifying aura he had directed at the Beta had vanished completely, replaced by a quiet, observant stillness that was entirely focused on her. Breathe, Elisa, Kyle murmured, his voice a low rumble that resonated pleasantly in the quiet hall. You have drawn your line. The earth did not shatter. You are still whole. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her hands slowly unclenching from tight fists at her sides. He will not let this go, she whispered, looking down at the intricate grain of the massive wooden table. David's pride is a fragile, dangerous thing. He will perceive my refusal as an act of personal warfare. He will retaliate. I am counting on it, Kyle replied smoothly, his tone remarkably conversational. He gestured toward a heavy side door at the far end of the hall. Come. If we are to anticipate a foolish king's retaliation, we must properly assess the board. He led her through the side door and down a short, dimly lit corridor that opened into a vast, circular chamber. This was the Blood Moon's tactical heart. Unlike the grand meeting hall, this room was strictly utilitarian. The walls were lined with ancient texts, modern communication arrays, and detailed topographical maps. In the center of the room stood a massive, circular table carved from solid slate, upon which a three-dimensional, magically illuminated map of the entire region glowed with a faint, silvery light. 3 figures were already present, leaning over the slate table. They were Kale's highest-ranking commanders, their bodies scarred and their postures rigid with martial discipline. As Kale entered, they immediately stood at attention, their eyes sweeping over Elisa. There was no disdain in their gazes, no dismissive sneers that she was so accustomed to from Crescent Moon elites. Instead, there was an intense, clinical curiosity. At ease, Kyle commanded softly, stepping up to the map. He gestured for Elisa to stand beside him. We are expecting a hostile incursion from the eastern border. David will not launch a full frontal assault. He lacks the fortitude for an open war he knows he cannot win. He will seek to strike quietly, to reclaim what he believes is his stolen property, without drawing the full wrath of our standing army. A tall, broad-shouldered commander, with a severe scar crossing his left eye, leaned forward. Our eastern patrols are doubled alpha. The terrain is treacherous. If they attempt a covert crossing through the Whispering Pines, our sentries will detect their scent long before they reach the inner valley. Kale studied the glowing map, his jaw tight. David is arrogant, Marcus, but he is not entirely devoid of cunning. He will use a distraction. He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Elisa. If you were David, seeking to bypass our eastern defenses, where would you redirect our attention? The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. The three commanders shifted slightly, their expressions betraying mild surprise that their Alpha King was soliciting tactical advice from a recently claimed unbonded. Elisa froze, her heart hammering. Her instinct, honed by years of conditioning, was to lower her eyes, to claim ignorance, to apologize for taking up space in a room meant for warriors. But as she looked at Kyle, she saw no expectation of failure. He was genuinely waiting for her answer. Elisa stepped closer to the slate table, her eyes tracing the glowing green and silver lines of the territorial borders. The years she had spent quietly organizing the Crescent Moon's chaotic logistics, quietly observing the elders' boastful arguments over dinner preparations, suddenly crystallized into sharp, actionable intelligence. He will not come through the Whispering Pines, Elisa said, her voice surprisingly steady. She reached out, her slender finger hovering over a narrow, shadowed gorge on the southern edge of the map. He will come through the sunken pass. Commander Marcus frowned respectfully. The pass is heavily fortified, my lady. The watchtowers there have overlapping fields of vision, but they rely on the Central River for their cooling systems, Elisa countered, leaning in, her mind racing. David knows this. 3 years ago, during the drought, he secretly mapped the underground tributaries feeding your river. He bragged about it to his beta during a banquet I was serving. If he dams the upper tributary on his side of the border, your watchtowers will overheat and trigger a temporary system reboot. That will give him a 15-minute window of absolute darkness. It is exactly the kind of theatrical, calculated risk he favors. Silence descended upon the tactical room. The commanders stared at her, their initial curiosity replaced by a profound, calculating respect. Kale did not smile, but a dangerous, triumphant light danced in his amber eyes. He looked at Marcus. Deploy a shadow unit to the upper tributary immediately. Kyle ordered, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He then turned back to Elisa, the faint ghost of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. It appears, Elisa, that the Crescent King's greatest mistake was teaching you to be invisible. He never realized you were watching his every move. The return journey to the Crescent Moon territory felt agonizingly slow to Thomas. The sleek black SUV, which had seemed like a chariot of authority when they departed, now felt like a rolling coffin. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody streaks of light across the heavily forested landscape, perfectly mirroring the dread churning in the beta's stomach. He had failed? Worse, he was returning with a message that would undoubtedly ignite the volatile powder keg of his alpha's ego. When the vehicle finally pulled into the grand courtyard of the Crescent Moon estate, The atmosphere was palpably tense. Sentinels stood in rigid, nervous formations. The usual evening chatter of the pack was entirely absent, replaced by a suffocating, fearful silence. Thomas did not wait for the door to be opened for him. He practically threw himself from the vehicle and marched directly toward David's private quarters, his polished shoes echoing ominously on the ancient stone steps. David was waiting in his expansive, dimly lit study. He stood by the roaring fireplace, a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid clutched tightly in his hand. The flickering flames cast deep, harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the erratic, dangerous energy rolling off him in waves. "Well?" David snapped, not turning around as the heavy double doors clicked shut behind his beta. "Is she in the vehicle, or did Kael require a demonstration of force before yielding?" Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He kept a respectful, cautious distance. "She is not with me, Alpha." Kael did not yield. David went entirely rigid. The crystal tumbler in his hand groaned under the sudden, immense pressure of his grip. "Explain," he demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "I delivered your terms exactly as instructed," Thomas said, choosing his words with agonizing care. "Kael rejected them. He maintains that she is acclaimed unbonded under his pack's eternal protection." Thomas paused, the next sentence tasting like ash in his mouth. "Furthermore, Elisa spoke." David slowly turned, his eyes narrowing into cold, furious slits. "She spoke? What could that weakling possibly have to say?" She addressed the envoy directly. "Alpha," Thomas whispered, his eyes dropping to the floor. "She verbally and formally accepted your rejection in front of all witnesses. The severing is now legally irrevocable." Kael added that if a single crescent wolf steps onto his land, he will view it as an act of war and march on this very room. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and violently compressed. Then, with a sudden, wordless roar of unadulterated rage, David hurled the heavy crystal glass against the stone fireplace. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, the amber liquid hissing violently as it struck the open flames. "She accepted it," David bellowed, pacing wildly across the thick Persian rug, his hands tearing at his hair. "She dared to accept it? After everything I gave her? After the roof I kept over her useless head?" He stopped, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and unhinged. "She wants to play the defiant queen? Fine. We will drag her back by her hair and lock her in the deepest cell we have." "That would be spectacularly foolish, David." The cool, melodic voice cut through the Alpha's frantic rant like a blade of ice. Thomas immediately bowed in deep respect as the former Luna, David's mother, stepped silently from the shadowed alcove near the library shelves. She wore a simple dark gown, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, but her eyes held a profound, terrifying disappointment. "Mother, this does not concern you," David growled, though his posture instinctively straightened under her piercing gaze. "My authority has been challenged. Kael has stolen from our pack." "Kael took precisely what you threw away," she countered, walking slowly toward the center of the room. She looked at the shattered glass on the hearth, then up at her son. "You are throwing a temper tantrum over a bruised ego, entirely blind to the catastrophic political blunder you have just committed." David bristled. "She is just an Omega." "She is an anomaly, David, and you were too arrogant to look past her designation," his mother snapped, her voice finally rising with sharp, authoritative anger. She stepped dangerously close to him. "Did you never wonder why your father insisted she be raised in the main house? Why she was always kept close, despite having no immediate family?" The echoing silence of the gorge marked the definitive end of an era. Elisa had stepped out of the suffocating shadows of rejection and into the brilliant light of her true destiny. She was no longer a discarded Omega, but the rightful heir of the Silver Keep and the formidable partner to the Blood Moon King. Together, they would redraw the maps of their world, proving that true power lies not in arrogant cruelty, but in recognizing the quiet strength that others foolishly throw away. Thank you for reading. If you enjoyed this cinematic journey of betrayal, tactical revenge, and ultimate redemption, please like this story, share it with your fellow fiction lovers, and subscribe for more thrilling, dramatic tales.